Two of those authors were Eric Shellman and Stephen Lazaritz, who co-wrote this book, Out of the Darkness. It chronicles the story of Mary Ellen Wilson, the first child in the U.S. removed from parental custody for reasons of abuse. The author spoke at the Museum of the City of New York. It's about an hour.
I'm Kathy Benson, and I work here at the Museum of the City of New York, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Museum of the City of New York for this very nice program. Among my tasks and my duties at the museum is coordinating exhibitions in the City Partners Gallery outside, and this gallery has been in operation since 1991. We've done any number of different exhibitions in partnership with outside cultural and community organizations and quasi-governmental organizations, and happily we have also done this Heritage of Care, the ASPCA exhibition. I've enjoyed working with Steve Zabostovsky and other staff of the ASPCA on it, and also with Ann Reiniger and Joe Gleason of the SPCC. I think some of the artifacts and some of the illustrations from 19th century newspapers are really, really unique. And among the most unique of the items, of course, is the clothing that belonged to Mary Ellen Wilson, whose story is the subject of this particular event tonight. I would like to now introduce Mr. Hawk, Mr. Larry Hawk, who's president of the ASPCA, who will say a few words. Thank you. Enjoy the evening.
Thank you. Welcome to everybody here. We really appreciate your turnout tonight to this event to really recognize a very historic story about the ASPCA. And we greatly appreciate Eric's and Steve's bringing this story to the general public about Mary Ellen, because it was a very important part of the ASPCA history, which has also been a very important part of New York, as the Museum of the City of New York has been as well. So thank you very much for that. Gentlemen, I'd like to, because this story is so important to the ASPCA, and we're so grateful to you, we'd like to make you honorary members of the ASPCA. These are pins that typically we only give to employees of the ASPCA, but we feel for the work you've done that we're very, very grateful, so thank you.
Great, thank you. I've admired the pin since I saw Steve wearing it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. If you haven't seen the exhibit, as mentioned, please take some time to see it. We're very proud of our history, and hopefully everybody can learn something from that. So without further ado, Eric.
Thank you very much.
You bet.
I need to get my pin on. Actually, I dropped the bag. That's okay. Yeah, we'll get you another one. Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate everybody showing up today. This is awesome. This has kind of been a dream of mine. I think anybody who feels they have a book in them, I didn't even particularly know I had this book in me at all, but I like to pretty much tell the story. First, let me thank Steve Zabostovsky, who was one of the primary contacts for me in the early searches for material on Mary Ellen, and Ann Reiniger and Joe Gleason, all instrumental in the writing of this book. Not to mention Steve Lazaritz here, who really piled it on me when I finally found him. I kind of like to go into how I stumbled on the story in the first place, because I was a fiction writer in California. I was looking for sources to write a novel, and I came across in a bookstore called the world's largest bookstore in Toronto, I came across this book called Significa. And this is a collection of more than 400 little-known facts, curiosities, and amazing but true stories. Well, obviously, Mary Ellen's story is amazing but true. But there's also stories in here. Thomas Edison inventing a machine to speak to the dead. As a fiction writer, I thought this would be a great idea to use as a little seed. Perhaps he succeeded and hid the plans because it was just too diabolical. Other stories about a blind man using an orangutan to help him run the switching station at a railroad. So all these little stories in here were quite interesting, and I thought this is a great book, so I picked it up. But on page 28, Mary Ellen's story stopped me dead in my tracks, because here's a little girl who, according to this story, was rescued because she was a member of the animal kingdom, or she was rescued under the premise that she was a member of the animal kingdom by the SPCA. Well, I soon discovered in my research that it really wasn't, that wasn't the case, but it drew me to the story, and learning that that really wasn't the case didn't lessen the impact of this story for me at all anyway. So I said, well, this doesn't lend itself to fiction too well. It's already stranger than fiction, so why don't I see if I can find a book on it? Well, I couldn't. I couldn't find any books on it. I could hardly find any information on Mary Ellen Wilson. This did give some dates, so I was able to go into the libraries, dig up information from newspaper archives, and find what I could, but it really wasn't enough. I was a fiction writer. I said, well, let me just start this process anyway. So I started writing this, this overblown tale of why Fannie Wilson, Mary Ellen's mother, originally left England, came up with all these little scenarios. But I wasn't satisfied because I didn't want to write a fiction novel about this. I wanted to write the story of Mary Ellen. So I noticed the SPCC was founded as a result of this case, so I decided to call New York and see if this SPCC was still there. And surely enough, they were, which amazed me. After over a century, this organization was still in existence. So I got in touch with, I think I was contacting Ann Reiniger at the time, who put me in touch with Joe Gleason. But I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that I lied in the beginning and said I was an undergraduate student writing a thesis on this subject because I didn't think they'd want to give a flake writer from California the information. So I don't know when I actually told them the truth or if I ever did really lie to you. I might have. I think I did lie. Oh, you know what? It was the Municipal Archives. I think I might have lied to them, New York Municipal Archives. But anyway, this is how determined I was to get the information on this story. So eventually, they really, honestly, they couldn't share a lot of information with me, and I don't know if I understood the reasons why. And I like to compare Mary Ellen, the importance of her life, being an abused child, severely abused little girl for so many years, and being rescued by an animal protection agency or by agents of an animal protection agency. I like to compare the impact she had on the children to follow her with Helen Keller, Anne Frank, people whose stories inspired a lot of people. And I look up on Amazon.com to find books on Helen Keller, and I find 180. I look for books on Anne Frank, and I find 140. I look for a book on Mary Ellen and find none. Well, right now you'll find one book. And as I also like to add, I think the market has been saturated with Mary Ellen books now, so there don't need to be any more. So, but what happened was, now I found the story. Now I needed to find a source. After striking out on finding the court transcripts at the New York Municipal Archives, I went back to the SPCC, desperate. Now, by this time, I'd already contacted Stephen Zawistowski from the SPCA, and he had supplied me with information on Henry Berg, because obviously Henry Berg is very instrumental in this entire in this whole rescue. So I needed to. I guess I don't know if I knew at that time that I wanted to incorporate so heavily Henry Berg into the story, but it became evident, I think, over time that we simply had to, because there was no way to escape the fact that this organization, which really sprung up at the exact same year that Mary Ellen was placed with Mary Connolly, who was her foster mother, who abused her so terribly for all these years, they actually began at the same time. Her abuse began at the same time the SPCA was founded, and these organizations, actually, these situations, they came together 7.5 years later. So I call them back, and I'm kind of pleading, help me, can you help me with anything? And they said, look, there was an American Heritage article in 1990, and it was an excellent article, and I think Joe told me you need to find Dr. Lazarus, who actually helped write this article. According to Steve, this is the article he wrote that has these authors' names on it. But that's okay, and it's not, I don't know why it struck me, why I didn't realize it first, but I go back and I look at this article that I had a really bad copy of. I actually have it here. I had a really bad copy of this from a library. Stephen sent me this one, Stephen Lazarus. It's called The First Chapter of Children's Rights. And as you can see, it has a great picture of Mary Ellen in it. It is the cover of the book. And all the pictures were courtesy of the Lazarus collection. So I slapped myself for not realizing this was the guy I needed to find. And I went on the internet, because I was on the internet in 93, 94. I punched in, I knew he was a pediatrician living in United States somewhere. I found that out from this article. So I went in and I punched in Stephen Lazarus. And I did a search. And I could only search my member list for the ISP, the internet provider that I was with. So I searched for Stephen Lazarus, and I was with Prodigy at the time. Well, up comes Stephen Lazarus' name. And I'm like, this can't be the right Lazarus. There has to be another Stephen Lazarus. So I clicked the member profile button, which tells me all about this Stephen Lazarus. And it said Stephen Lazarus, MD, resident of Wisconsin, and here's his email address. You were in New York at that time? See, memory serves. So I sent him an email. And next day I got a call at work. And he said, well, how can I help you? I said, well, I'm a California writer who wants to write a book on Mary Ellen Wilson. And I said, I've actually already started. I have like 100 pages, but I'm not really, I need help. Would you be happy to help me? And he goes, I'd be happy to collaborate with you if you'd like. And I said, well, okay, let's do it, because this was the guy I needed. If you'd like to come on up, we can go. Do you like? Okay, good. So I felt I need to prove myself first to Steve. Now, he didn't insist on it, but as far as he knew, I was just a voice on the phone. So I thought I need to send him some writing. So I sent him a couple of short stories I'd written and maybe an article or two. And then I waited. And I didn't hear anything. It was like a week and a half, 2 weeks, and I still didn't hear anything. And finally, I get this big FedEx box in the mail, like this big. Now, I open it up, and it's overflowing with articles and stuff like this, stuff Steve snaked out of the Copyright Office and got kicked out for photographing. These are copies of sheet music that were written about Mary Ellen back in the 1800s. So I get this package, and this is it. Now I can really start writing the book. Now, when I had contacted the municipal archives earlier on, and I was asking them, I said, well, there has to be court transcripts, right? So I should be able to get these court transcripts or public documents. So I call and ask, and they say, well, let us look. At first, they didn't really recognize the case, which drove me crazy because this was such an important case. I was going, okay, well, Mary Ellen, Mary Connolly. But see, at this time, they didn't really know her name. They called her Mary Ellen Connolly. They called her Mary Ellen McCormick. They called her everything except Mary Ellen Wilson. So I gave him the information I could. And finally, he comes back and says, well, I have a couple of little things, some of the charges filed, and when I got it back, it was like 2 photocopies of, We the People versus Mary Connolly, but there was really only a couple of charges that I had listed on paper. So at that point, I go, well, thank you very much. And I told Steve, or actually I called the NYSPCC again, because I always went back to them. They were my one remaining hope for information on Mary Ellen. And I didn't understand, again, and I kind of relate this back to the Helen Keller and the Anne Frank, I didn't understand why Mary Ellen disappeared into history and nobody knew who she was, and how her rescue and the founding of the first child protection agency could just go unnoticed and lost over 120 years. And the reason is, and I talked to Anne about this the other day, the reason is Mary Ellen, first of all, they couldn't release information on it because it's a confidentiality issue. They don't release information on any of the children that they help, and they can't because the families that are out there, they wouldn't appreciate it. So I understood that. I think I was a little frustrated. I'm going, it's a century ago. But you know what? There was family remaining, and maybe they wouldn't have liked that. Luckily, something comes out in the future that actually helped us quite a bit. So I said, do you have the transcripts by any chance? And Ann and Joe said, yeah, we do have the transcripts, but again, we can't release them to you. And I said, and I told Steve, I said, Steve, they have the transcripts. So had I found you yet? I'm losing it here. Okay. So, yeah, it actually is. But so anyway, we got started on the book. I told Steve we needed authorization, which was going to be really difficult to get because the NYSPCC said we need authorization to get these transcripts. I told Steve, all frustrated, that we had to have this, and he goes, well, I know Mary Ellen's granddaughter. So why don't you come on up and fill in the story from here.
Well, first I want to thank particularly Ann Reiniger and Joe Gleason, who really helped unlock this for us. And probably one of the most thrilling days that I can remember is when Joe Gleason handed me to hold Mary Ellen's dress. Do you remember that? Where's Joe? Where's Joe sitting? Do you remember that day? And I was almost in tears when I held that dress. It was like holding the most precious thing on the face of the earth. So I want to thank Joe and Ann for that. I first became interested in the case of Mary Ellen when I entered the field of child abuse. I'm a pediatrician that specialized in child abuse, and that began in 1983. And I was putting together a lecture on child abuse, and I wanted to jazz it up with some historical things. And I came upon the story of Mary Ellen, which everyone in social work knows. In Social Work 101, there's the story of Mary Ellen. And actually, I took Social Work 101 in college, and I heard the story of Mary Ellen. And when I went back to look at it, it sounded phony. The story, the whole thing sounded too stylized, and I really thought there had to be more about that. And the way I pursued it was finding information on Henry Berg. And I think of all the people throughout history that have gotten a bad shake, Henry Berg should be known to everyone in this country. Everyone in the whole country should know who Henry Berg is. But if you ask people, very few people do, unless they're in animal protection. And the reason for that is Henry Berg had a pivotal point in history, not only in protecting animals, but in protecting children. And when I started reading about Henry Berg, I became obsessed that there had to be a lot more of this. And it for a while became my hobby, collecting things and articles and newspaper clippings about Henry Berg and then about the case of Mary Ellen. One of the excellent book that if you can get a copy of, Angel in a Top Hat, was written in the late 40s by Zulma Steele, is the book. Now, I'm told Steve Z thinks there's some inaccuracies in it, but even if there are, it's a great book about Henry Berg, and anyone who's interested in animal protection should get a copy of that book. But reading that book, I got a lot of information about Berg, and I was hooked. I had to find out all there was about the case of Mary Ellen. And that quest got me thrown out of the Library of Congress. It got me thrown out of a nursing home in Rochester, New York. But here's how we found and unlocked this. Now, it's very ironic. Nothing changes in hundreds of years. You see the picture of Mary Ellen that's on the book. I see kids that look like this today, that are beaten and starved and look like Mary Ellen did so many years ago. But just last week, I was having a discussion with the head of the Child Welfare Bureau of Milwaukee, saying that we have to loosen up some of these confidentiality rules, because when we want to do an investigation medically, we need to know some of the facts you get. And they're pretty firm and pretty rigid on this confidentiality. And so I think it's ironic that, as Eric said, that was prohibiting them, their concern about confidentiality, which I think is really incredible, that holding on to a case because of confidentiality all those years is an admirable thing. Back then, I thought these people are pig-headed, not releasing the information to us, but I was convinced I had to track down Mary Ellen's descendants. And I started, basically, when I started looking into this, we lived in Washington, and then we moved to Buffalo, New York, which is very near where Mary Ellen grew up. And so I'd make little day trips to the Rochester area, looking through newspapers, microfilms, looking for the obituary of Mary Ellen's husband, who I then found out was Louis Shutt. I looked through every year for about 20 years for the obituary for Louis Shutt, and I finally found it on a microfilm one day, and listed among the descendants was a woman named Florence Brasser. And I was real excited that I had someone who I could look into, and I looked in the phone book under Brasser, and I found a heading for the Florence Brasser School. And I thought this couldn't be coincidence. So I actually drove over to the school, and there's a big picture of Florence Brasser, and I went to the principal, and he pulled out Florence Brasser's personnel file. They had named this school after Mary Ellen's daughter, whose name is Florence Brasser. More significant than that, they named the school after her while she still worked there. So she taught at the school named after her for about 5 years. And I said to the principal, thank you for this information. It's really too bad that Florence died. And he looked at me and said, Florence didn't die, she's still alive. And he told me the name of this nursing home she was in. So quickly I got in my car and drove to the nursing home. At the front desk, I said, hi, I'm Dr. Lazaritz here to see Florence Brasser, and they escorted me into a room. And In 10 minutes, the administrator of the nursing home came in and started screaming at me and threw me out. So I left my card, and I said, have her relatives call me, which they did several days later. Shirley Mellenbacher and Frank Mellenbacher, who Florence, of course, was Mary Ellen's daughter. Mary Ellen had two daughters, Etta and Florence, in the pictures. One of my favorite pictures is out there in the display of Mary Ellen and her two daughters. And Florence was her younger daughter. Etta was the older daughter. Etta Wheeler was the namesake. So Etta was named after Etta Wheeler. As you'll see in the history, Etta Wheeler was the social worker who found Mary Ellen in the slums of New York. So I got to know the family a little bit. I talked to them on the phone, I visited, and they were very interesting in that they didn't know much about Mary Ellen. They did not know much. Shirley did not know much about her grandmother. And the little information she had, she showed me their whole collection of information on her grandmother was a clipping from that great journal, the National Enquirer. It was a little clipping, a little thing in National Enquirer, and that was all the family knew about this case. So I shared all my information, and they got very interested in this, and were very happy to sign a release of information, which I then, with great glee, presented to Ann Reiniger and Joe Gleason, and which culminated in a trip to New York. And Joe was kind of like the Cheshire Cat. He had all this great information, and he was just so proud of it, but he couldn't show it to anyone. I mean, it was just great. He just had all this stuff, and he just couldn't. And so I spent several hours meeting with Joe and Ann, and they were very gracious in giving the information. Well, around then, I thought that I had known everything there is about Mary Ellen, and I wrote a little article called Whatever Happened to Mary Ellen, talking about her life after this, until Eric started saying, no, we need more. And that's when we started getting more information and more information. So I would have finished my interest in Mary Ellen with this article in American Heritage, which this writer, it's a funny story, which I don't know all the details, but this writer named Marion Eide wrote the whole article, but had to put someone else's name on it because this person sent a letter to the magazine saying, why not have an article on this topic? And he had nothing to do with writing the article, but she had to put his name on it. Marion is a PhD now in comparative literature, a very good writer, and she came up to Buffalo, and I gave her all my information on Mary Ellen because, hey, the idea is to get the information out there, not to save it for yourself. So it's an excellent article, Marion. Peter Stevens actually did not write one word of this, and I don't even know.
He's the only author who responded when I asked for help from these guys.
Yeah.
He goes, anything you need, call me.
That's very interesting. So the quest for Mary Ellen was a long, tortuous one, and a lot of interesting stories, like getting thrown out of the Copyright Office when I photographed these things, and they didn't like the fact that I was photographing it, so they threw me out of that. But the music here was finding this was just a gem, and I'll just read you one verse. This was in 1876, and I still think this is a great piece of work. See within that dismal chamber, clothed in rags and chilled with fear, no kind father to protect her, with no watchful mother near. Weeps an infant, pale and feeble, victim of her keeper's rage, tender flower crushed and broken, blighted in her budding age. Who will help this little orphan, left on earth without a friend? Who will shelter and protect her? Who will peace and mercy send? And that was the song Little Mary Ellen that was written in 1876, and that was dedicated to Henry Bergh. And then there was a follow-up song that was written the same year, but it was a follow-up, Mother Sent an Angel to Me, and this is dedicated to Elbridge Gerry. So very interesting things came out of this. But writing the book was, Eric did most of the actual writing of the book, and collaborating by email and fax machine and phone was quite interesting. Eric and I never met in person. We worked together for 6 years, and last July was the first time we met in person. This is only the second time we've ever seen each other. And so that's an interesting part of all this. But let me turn it over to Eric and see what comments he has at this point.
Now, when we got these transcripts, finally, it was really time to start almost start the book over, because now we had so much information we could really go, and we could really make it accurate, and we had actual testimony from people that were involved and overheard Mary Ellen screaming and running down the hall, people that saw Mary Ellen downstairs on those rare moments when she got to go outside to the water closet. So we started the book over. I would write a chapter, and every evening I had to work during the day, so I'd write a chapter in the evening, and I'd email it over to Steve. Steve would review the chapter, and he'd send it back and say, "That was great!" And I'd go, "Well, Steve, here, take it back again and read it, and let's make it more critical. I need you to really work me over here a little bit, and let's make sure that I've done it right." So he would go through, and he'd be more critical of me, and he'd make corrections and change some things, and we'd go ahead and modify that and move on to the next chapter. So that's how we went back and forth for a good year and a half on the first draft of this book. Again, these transcripts were the key to really putting this thing together with all the stuff that we had. The interviews, to know a little bit about Mary Ellen as a woman also helped. We learned that Mary Ellen liked to collect little pieces of colorful string. Well, it goes to follow probably that Mary Ellen as a little girl didn't have toys. This woman beat her like that. She wasn't going to buy her toys, much less reading books and that sort of thing. So it goes to figure that Mary Ellen had only little pieces of colorful string with which to entertain herself when she was alone, locked in the closet, whatever. So this is just one of those things that made sense to us, having all this information. Now, writing this book with Steve was such an experience. As I said, I was a fiction writer. We didn't want to write a book that would be I don't think either of us wanted to. I'm not sure how he originally took the fact that I wanted to write this almost like a dramatized history. This book is really written in such a way that you could take it and put it in a TV movie and it would be ready. There would be really no adaptation necessary because it is written in...
It's for a TV producer.
There you go. It's written in scenes. It's also written as a dramatic story. And you know what that has done is draw more people into this story that would not ordinarily have read a book like this. In fact, I'm not sure if you experienced this at signing, Steve, but the book is up there, maybe the poster is up there, Mary Ellen, and people walk by with their children and they just, and they try to hide their kid's face. Don't look at that. And little girl's, terribly abused. And that's why I'm saying, look at that. Don't hide that. Talk to your children about it. And I actually shared earlier a story about a little boy named Andrew who came to a Barnes & Noble signing of mine the other night. And this little boy, since his father had talked to him in Boy Scouts, apparently they had to sign something. They had to discuss child abuse together and sign this form together about child abuse. And this boy was fascinated with it, very fascinating. In fact, he went out and got Dave Pelzer's book, A Child Called It. Dave Pelzer was a very abused child. They say he was the third most abused child in California, and he was the only one that survived. But this book was compelling to this little boy, Andrew. He read it twice. He bought Dave's follow-up book and read that one. And he came to my signing, he wanted to read my book. And he did this because, first of all, his father exposed him to it. This kid could grow up to be a great caregiver of children someday. Who knows? So I say, no, don't hide their faces from it. Turn their faces toward it. Buy the book. Tell them about it. So that's one of the other things about the book. I feel it's written in a way that draws more people in than it otherwise would have. I don't even know if I would have read it if it were a biography. That's not what I do.
We had a discussion about whether to do just a factual, historical thing. And when Eric first said, well, let's dramatize it and fill in some of the gaps the way it would have been, I thought, oh, this guy's a flake.
See?
But then we had actually, he can pick it up. They turn up he can't. Oh, okay. I thought you could turn it up. But when we had parts of it that were all historical, correct, without dialogue, it didn't flow. It didn't get the story across. And so I think the way that it was done was really appropriate to tell this story. And we did research all of the information. There was a great deal of research in the Civil War and parts of New York, and that was done to make everything accurate the way it would have been, and the dialogues the way it would have been. Now, most of it is the court transcript, which is absolutely true, and it's incredible that these transcripts are still around. And I think it's a testimony to the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children that they are around and were preserved and kept for us to use. But some of the dialogue in these transcripts sounds like fiction. It really does. And especially, you don't have that here, do you?
I don't know.
Okay, you don't have some of the things that we didn't use were just really, really great and classic bits of courtroom drama.
Well, I'm going to throw in a couple of things about Henry Bergh now. While we have such great people who know so much about Henry Bergh in this room, I'll throw out one of the stories about Salamander the Firehorse, one of my favorites. P.T. Barnum, who was Henry Bergh and P.T. Barnum, they went at it quite often because Bergh didn't approve a lot of things Barnum did with the animals. And there was a show that he had called Salamander the Firehorse. Well, Bergh said, look, P.T., if you're going to have Salamander jump through that ring of fire tonight, we're going to come down with my agents and we're going to arrest you. So Barnum said, come on down, bring them all with you. So he does. He shows up there at the Hippodrome, and he goes down, and there's, sure enough, Salamander the Firehorse. So they light the ring of fire, and Salamander jumps through. I think it was followed by P.T. Barnum jumped through. P.T. Barnum's wife jumped through, and the mayor or somebody like that jumped through. And Bergh was a little bit embarrassed, but you know what? He didn't. It's okay. He didn't care. He kept his quest up, and it's just another one of those little stories. About there's also the story of the cat that was built into the corner of the marble structure of the building. Bergh stands there and he makes them take each marble block away until this cat is freed, and he gathers this huge crowd. Now Bergh was also a media genius. He knew how to work the media. For instance, when he picked up Mary Ellen, he made sure that there were plenty of reporters at the courthouse, so when they carried this child into the courthouse, that it was no secret to anybody. So that's just another way that he knew how to get things exposed. Let me kind of go over one thing that we did when we got this book in what we thought was a finished state. I believe it was 440 pages long. It was quite a bit longer than it is now. We started sending it out, and we were told, well, you know, it's an interesting story, but this it can't sustain more than 200 pages. Well, that's an interesting analysis of the book. Geez, and I kind of ignored them. But we sent it out to other agents, and sure enough, it wasn't getting bitten on. I think part of it was because of the way it was written. It was written, again, in a dramatized format. Nobody knew how to classify this book. Is it a biography? Is it history? Is it historical fiction? Well, it's in our own class. It's dramatized history, I guess. So we ended up discussing it and deciding, hey, let's go through and trim it. So we did go through and trim it, and we trimmed it by about 100-plus pages, about 120 pages. Well, when we trimmed it down, it became a lot tighter. We took out a lot of the fluff that we really had to take out. We had the transcripts now. We had a lot of factual information, and in fact, enough to make a legitimate-sized book that was accurate and was actually fast-paced. Now, most people who read this book say they can't put it down, which is just a testament to the actual editing process.
One of the problems, there are so many stories you could tell about Henry Bergh. And one of the questions we had, how prominent do we make Henry Bergh? Because, you know, you go on for hours talking about Henry Bergh. Eric told a couple of stories. Henry Bergh actually did a lot of things for animals that are not famous. For instance, he invented the clay pigeon for trap shooting. In his time, they would actually pluck the eyeballs out of pigeons to make them fly erratically, and Henry Bergh invented that. He also started an ambulance service for horses that were injured that happened several years before the first ambulance service for humans in New York City that was started by Bellevue Hospital. And so on and on. But the thing that I think is most interesting about Henry Bergh is Henry Bergh really didn't like animals individually. He did not have any dogs or cats. He didn't like children either, for that matter. He's quoted once in waking up in a hotel saying there should be separate hotels for people with children and people without children. But when asked several times why he did this, you know, he didn't care for individual animals, but he cared for all the animals. He didn't care for individual children, but he cared for all the children. His response was always the same, because it's the right thing to do. And so Bergh was a very principled man, and his life was built on principle and not because he happened to have a liking for an individual dog, which Eric has a liking for individual dogs. We joke, Eric is into greyhound rescue, and I'm into child rescue. So we're on the opposite spheres of that. But that was one of the dilemmas: how big a figure to make Berg? We could, Berg we could write about forever, and. But there is a book about Berg, Angel in the Top Hat, which hopefully someone will update sometime and bring it up to date.
Okay. Now, we are complete opposites, perhaps, because we're double income, no kids. He's single income, 6 kids. And I think that, if I'm not mistaken, is the maximum you can have in Wisconsin. Just kidding. I do Greyhound, X-Racing Greyhound placement and rescue, and he helps abused children. So you put that all together, these two came together and wrote a book about a little girl who happened to be rescued by an animal protection agency. So it's all kind of strange, but it makes an odd sense. There's one thing in here that I love, and I want to read this to you. I'm not necessarily, I'm done, but this is a great tail end to this article. This was written by Etta Wheeler, and she wrote Henry Berg, and she was telling Henry just what was going on with Mary Ellen. Now, Mary Ellen, when she left the Sheltering Arms, went to Spencerport, and she ended up living with Etta Wheeler's sister.
Could I make a comment about
Please
the
do.
Sheltering Arms? When Mary Ellen was rescued, she was sent to the Sheltering Arms, and then shortly after was transferred to the Home for Homeless Girls, the Home for Friendless Girls. And that home was a home for teenage runaways, prostitutes, and criminals. And so it's very interesting. The first case of child protection resulted in the first inappropriate foster placement, which I think is very ironic. But now you can finish.
It was more like incarceration, really.
Well, it was inappropriate. And Etta Wheeler went to court. She went to the judge and said, "No way. We want this girl placed somewhere else."
Yeah, she didn't belong there. I mean, she was surrounded by an element that really, she was absolutely innocent. Here is Etta Wheeler's recap. Here began a new life, Wheeler wrote. The child was an interesting study, so long shut within 4 walls and now in a new world. Woods, fields, green things growing were all strange to her. She had not known them. She had to learn, as a baby does, to walk upon the ground. She had walked only upon floors, and her eye told her nothing of uneven surfaces. But in this home there were other children, and they taught her as children alone can teach each other. They taught her to play, to be unafraid, to know her rights and to claim them. She shared their happy, busy life, from the making of mud pies up to charming birthday parties, and was fast becoming a normal child. She has some faults that are of the graver sort. She tells fibs and sticks to them bravely, steals lumps of sugar and cookies and only admits to it when the crumbs are found in her pocket. In short, she's very much like other children, loving, responding to kindness and praise, hating a task unless there be a play or a reward thereof, and inevitably forgetting what she does not wish to remember. What children do not do some or all of these forbidden things? She is a favorite with nearly all the people who have come to know her. Now, another thing I like to add is that because Mary Ellen went on to live her life, she didn't really go out and tour the country or tour the state coming out against child abuse. She basically moved on, and I also look at it this way. She was a very resilient little girl. I like to use the comparison. Everybody's heard, hey, that guy was born bad. Well, I think Mary Ellen was born resilient. She was born tough, because if you think of all the things this little girl went through, first of all, born to loving parents. Nobody could control what happened to her parents. Read the book if you really want to know. But after this, she's placed in an orphanage. And in this orphanage on Blackwell's Island in the middle of the East River, they have an 85% death rate, which I think improved to 75% by the time she got there. But, it's still amazing that she survived it. Now, disease was sweeping the tenements. At any given time, it would sweep through and take most of the children because they're young and not as strong as adults. She's placed with Mary Connolly. Well, actually, it wasn't Mary Connolly at the time, Mary McCormick. But she survives this. She survives this abuse for all these years. She survives these diseases. And then when she gets out and she's placed in a loving home finally, it's like, this is like Disneyland to her. How can it not be? She's never known any different, so she doesn't realize her plight in the first place. She sees the children playing, but she knows that she can't do that, and maybe she just didn't know what she was going through. So when she got out, she moved on. And I kind of look at it like our greyhounds. They were born to live in a crate and race, and that's all they love to run. But when they get out and they finally get placed in a loving home, this is great. It's like the condo is like a mansion. So it's like they don't look back and they're not depressed about the crate they lived in. And Mary Ellen obviously wasn't either. She was just enjoying all these new things that were happening, enjoying these children she was getting to play with, and enjoying a normal life. I'm not sure why she didn't marry until 26. That's correct?
Yes.
You might have some insight on this?
Her daughter told me that Mary Ellen was afraid of men, and she didn't like men. And the reason for that is most of her abuse did not happen at her foster mother's hands, but her daughter said that most of the abuse happened by her husband. And in the story of Mary Ellen, when this was brought to court, her husband had, McCormick, had already, Conley, I mean, had already fled to New Jersey. So he had left the scene, and so she was left with the rap. She's the one that went to prison for a year. But her daughter said that all Mary Ellen had talked about and told her was the abuse at his hands, and she was afraid of men. In fact, even Shirley told me that she was afraid of strange men. And so that Louis Shutt had to be a very special person for Mary Ellen to marry him, because she really did not like strange men. Right. I think at this point, before we have more in the program tonight, see if anyone has any questions they want to ask.
That sounds great. This will only be the first group with no questions.
Yes. Have to be some questions. Yes, thank you.
Would you comment on the role that Jacob Riis played in terms of creating the Mary Ellen myth?
Well, actually, thank you for asking that. I was going to talk about Jacob Riis is another. This story was a lot of interesting, powerful personalities that came into play with each other. One of them, of course, was Berg, but Jacob Riis is a story in itself. And Jacob Riis, people don't know much about Jacob Riis. They should. Riis Park in Queens is named after Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis was attributed almost single-handedly to wiping out the Lower East Side tenement slums that existed in the late 1800s. And he did this through his reporting and his photography. Jacob Riis was not only known as a reporter, but as a photographer. And he photographed the conditions in the slums at that time, mostly the children. He wrote several books that are classics in the social work history, Children of the Poor, How the Other Half Lives. And one interesting story about Jacob Riis, he would photograph in the same manner that Matthew Brady and Lewis Hines did. He was a big 8x10 camera, use a flash bar, and if he wanted to take a picture of an interior, ignite the flash, and a flash would go up. On 2 occasions, when they set off the flash, the building he was photographing was burnt down on 2 occasions.
But he got a great shot.
Jacob Riis was not above embellishing stories to make it a good story. And the myth of Mary Ellen, that she was saved on the warrant of an animal, and the whole myth that she was saved under animal protection statutes came from Jacob Riis's reporting. And it just sounded, and it still sounds today, this is great. This kid was saved because there are laws to protect animals, but not to protect children. So she was saved because she was a member of the animal kingdom. Well, it's true that there were laws, and Henry Berg had saw that in 1861, founding the society, that there were laws to protect animals, but she was not rescued on animal protection statutes. She was brought to court on a habeas corpus writ, but the whole aura of the Mary Ellen case, the writings were embellished by Jacob Riis. And so you're right, Jacob Riis was the one probably responsible for making the myth of Mary Ellen. There was an article by a social worker in Alabama, Sally Watkins, called The Myth of Mary Ellen, which was one of the first people who just looked at this and said, wait a minute, Jacob Riis was not telling the truth. Any other questions? Well, one of the things Jacob Riis wrote was, on leaving the courtroom, Etta Wheeler took Henry Berg's hand and said, could there now be a society for the prevention of cruelty to children? And it was said, he reported that Berg took her hand and said emphatically, there shall be one. And so I think that's a good introduction to Ann Reiniger, who will tell us about how that came about. Ann is the executive director of the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which Berg said emphatically, there shall be one. So, Ann.
Thank you, Eric and Stephen, for bringing the story of Mary Ellen to so many other people. As they said, the Society was the first child protective agency ever created, and the founder was Elbridge T. Gerry, who was counsel to the ASPCA and a good friend of Henry Bergh. And when Henry Bergh was alerted to the fact that Mary Ellen was a child in need by Etta Wheeler, he wrote a note to Elbridge Gerry and said, quickly, you must act. How can we save this child? How can we help this child? And it was then that Elbridge Gerry did his research and found this archaic writ of habeas corpus whereby the child could be removed from the home, brought to court, and then, as was said, Mary Connolly was prosecuted criminally. That was really the only way that one could handle a case like this. There were already a lot of child care agencies around, the Foundling Hospital, Sheltering Arms, who could care for children who were brought to them. But there was no agency that could intervene in a family and remove that child who was at risk. And the balancing of the rights of a family to raise a child as they see fit and the society's obligation to protect children was the tension that was felt then, and to this day is the tension that is felt. Well, having removed the child, Jacob Riis was in the courtroom. There were reports in the newspapers, and as today the media attention brought the city's attention to this problem, and they started getting a lot of calls at the ASPCA about children in need of protection. And Elbridge Gerry, Henry Bergh, and John Wright together brought their friends together, and then the following year formed and organized and incorporated the New York Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children. They did it by statute in the New York State Legislature. And from the founding of the Society, which was the first agency which had the authority to intervene in a family on behalf of a child, societies sprung up all over the city, all over the state, all over the world. And it was these private charities that provided this protection. We were like quasi-law enforcement. It was very much aligned to the police department. In fact, our office and our agency was as if it was a bureau of the police department. And the work that was done was being alerted to children in need of protection and then removing those children. And then the prosecution would take place in the court. It would be criminal prosecution for the most part. And it wasn't until the 30s, after societies were established all over the world, that in the United States, the government started getting involved and took it on as their responsibility to protect children, which is the case in most places today. But the society still had a lot of work. We still have a lot of work. Last year, 3 million children were reported suspected of abuse or neglect in America. Every day, 3 children die as a result of abuse. So there's still a lot of work to do. The Society has protected over 2 million children in our time. We're in New York City. We continue to protect children in the courts, and we also have started innovative strategies in protection and prevention of child abuse in the communities in New York City. In fact, we continue to work from time to time with the ASPCA. Just the other day, we received a letter from the ASPCA about a child who we are protecting in court, where there was an incident of a pet who was brought to the ASPCA and who died as a result of injuries. And the question was, who injured the cat? Was it the child? Was it a parent? Was it somebody else? And the information that was provided by the ASPCA is very helpful to us in our representation and our protection of this very young child. We're so pleased that the two of you have written Out of the Darkness. It is the most accurate retelling of the story of Mary Ellen that I have ever seen, and as was mentioned, Joe Gleason, who is with us today and who is our archivist, knows lots of the ins and outs of Mary Ellen as well as other stories. And yes, we do keep our records confidential to protect the families of those living and their descendants. A lot of times families reach out to us, or people reach out to us to find out about their family's history, and that's something that once we're assured this is that person, then that record is, of course, available to that person about their own family. But these are very sensitive issues and sometimes things that people want to keep personal. If they want everyone to know, fine. But if not, then we don't feel it's our right to reveal that information. In this case, Mary Ellen's granddaughter did give American Heritage at the time permission to have access to the file. We still have the original file. Every piece of information that was there in 1875 is there today, and we have maintained our files. We have an archives, the George S. Johnson Archives, which includes every case that we have ever handled. And we were pleased to be able to share this information with you. There is, as you've heard and as you probably know just by living in America, that there's a continued need for citizens such as Henry Berg and Elbridge T. Gerry to be aware of child abuse. And so we have to all work together to stop the abuse. And Out of the Darkness helps bring this awareness to so many more people. And for that, we are thankful. Are there any particular questions? Yeah?
The Children's Aid Society?
The Children's Aid Society is an agency which cares for children mostly in foster care. So we might work together if a child is removed, a child is in need of care, they would be caring for the child. And there are a lot of common issues. We provide direct service, but we're also concerned about laws, and as is Children's Aid Society. So we will work together with them, but our missions are a little bit different. But we all are interested in protecting children. Yes?
Most of your cases, they originate from animal abuse first?
No. No, most cases that are brought to the attention of us and from the beginning are issues of substance abuse, alcohol abuse being really even more than the cocaine and heroin that gets so much media attention, and then issues of domestic violence. Lots of domestic violence is found where there is also child abuse, and sometimes mental illness as well are areas where that call for our intervention. Okay.
Good evening. I want to thank you all for being here. I'm Steve Zawistowski. I've been with the ASPCA for 11 years. When I first joined the organization, if you all remember the building that used to be on the corner of First and York, our building over there, my first office was in the basement, and they built my office out of what had been a conference room library. And when I moved in, I discovered a stack of boxes in one corner, and being somewhat curious, I opened them up, and what I discovered was the ASPCA archives, or at least a part of it. And when I started reading through those, and I read a lot, I'm the only person alive who's read 133 ASPCA annual reports, I found an extraordinary story, a story of a man who changed the way we think about children, animals, and other people. And I looked at that history, and over the years I've talked to many people, and one of the reasons I'm so pleased about seeing this book is I had told Eric and Steve that over the years I've had probably at least a dozen people talk to me about doing a movie, doing a book, doing a television show about Henry Berg and the ASPCA or the Mary Ellen story. This is really the first one that's actually ever been there. It's become tangible. I also want to thank the Museum of the City of New York for their generosity in hosting the show that we've had here since the first part of July. It'll be here through the end of October. It's a wonderful opportunity to bring people through, and children in particular, to see some important part of the history of the city of New York. There's some fascinating photographs and sketchings and things, and I know Kathy and I had a lot of fun going through old photographs, and there's a spectacular picture of Henry Berg who's stopping a trolley car that's overloaded. And in the background, you can see this arm of the Statue of Liberty when it was on its tour to raise money to collect the funds to complete the statue and actually put up the pedestal in the harbor. And it's such an interesting link of this image of somebody liberating animals and this sign of the liberation of our country. One of the things I want to mention is Eric and Steve talked about some of the innovations of Henry Berg in terms of the clay pigeon, in terms of the ambulances. I want to let you know that these innovations haven't slackened and they haven't left. And in particular in this area, in the last several years, our agents are mandatory reporters of child abuse in the state of New York. And we now run a program called New York City Family Vision, which is Violence Intervention Sharing Information Network. And we bring together on a quarterly basis NYPD, child protection, animal protection organizations, because what we do see is that when there's violence in a home, that violence extends to all those who can't protect themselves, whether they're children, women, the aged, or the animals. We like to say that animal cruelty does not lead to domestic violence. Animal cruelty is domestic violence. We also have started a brand new program which involves psychological intervention for animal cruelty offenders. We have a full-time clinical psychologist working with us, and we now have an arrangement set up with the district attorney's office so that when people are brought in for animal cruelty offenses, part of their probation, part of their sentence will be going through psychological counseling. And certainly what we see when we talk to these people is a history not only of violence to animals, but also violence and mistreatment of others. I want to close with sort of a final observation on Henry Berg. Henry Berg was married to Catherine Matilda Taylor for over a quarter of a century. He carried on a long-term, passionate love affair with her. And in fact, he died shortly after she did, just a year after she passed away. Henry and Catherine never had children of their own. But I always like to think about the fact that every time somebody steps in to prevent the abuse and the mistreatment of any child, I think Henry Berg and Catherine can claim that child as their own. I'd like to invite people now to meet the authors. They're going to be signing copies of their book. We have more refreshments in the back, and if you haven't had a chance, please take the time to see the exhibit that we have. It'll be here through the end of October. Bring some friends. It's a story I think that needs to be told.
Eric Shellman, when last we saw you, you were at the Museum of the City of New York talking about the book that you co-authored. Right. What brings you out today